Thank you. Good morning. My name is Michael Hoffman. I'm a member of the board of MAS, and I am pleased to introduce the panel that's going to discuss election 2012 and what's at stake. As we sit here today, it's just 18 days away from an election, and yet we've yet to hear from either of the candidates very much about cities and how urban areas factor in the federal agenda. With 80% of Americans living in cities, the 21st century should be the century of the city. We know, however, the geography of our electoral districts does not reflect that reality. In fact, it's disproportionately favoring rural and suburban voters. The greatest federal policy challenges, however, of our day are fundamentally urban. They are housing, energy, education, infrastructure, immigration, and economic policy, which directly affect the future of American cities and its residents. Main Street in 21st century America is no longer the bucolic town in the nation's heartland. It must include bustling centers like New York, and all American urbanists know our nation's economic, social, and cultural pulse is driven by cities. Here to underscore how much this election means to New York and cities across America, and to set out the challenges before us in engaging the federal government, no matter which side wins, are Carol Coletta, who's the president of Coletta and Company, the National Placemaking Collaborative Art Place, and her panelists, Harry Moroz, federal correspondent for Next American City and co-founder of City Leads, Alicia Glen, managing director at Goldman Sachs, who's responsible for their urban investment group, and Toni Griffin, professor of architecture and director of the J. Max Bond Center at CCNY. Welcome, Carol and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you may have seen this headline in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Republicans to cities, drop dead. And if you were here, how many of you were here yesterday? Heard Bruce Katz. Bruce's contention is that if the president is reelected, it will be about this same headline. I'm not sure I agree with Bruce, but nonetheless, there is a hostility, I think, in terms of the rest of America, if you will, the rest of America, most of whom live in cities, but there seems to be this political hostility to cities. It certainly isn't viewed, policy is not viewed as favorable to cities. Why is that, Harry?
So I think there are two kind of classes of reasons. One are kind of the structural reasons we all know. The representation of cities in the federal government is skewed away from cities, towards the suburbs, and even towards rural areas. We have representatives in Congress who really don't think that what goes on in urban areas affects their districts, even though kind of the research shows that is untrue. The other reasons are kind of more cultural. There's been some research done that shows that the framing of urban issues is really important at the federal level. So when we talk about federal aid for cities, how we frame that, whether we frame it as aid directly for cities or as kind of aid for a more general social safety net, matters. So those are kind of the two classes of reasons that have led to this led to cities kind of not being focused on at the federal level.
Yeah, well, but since the innovation and productivity, right, that drives America comes from cities, it's interesting. I mean, do you see an opportunity to reknit the narrative in a way that is favorable to cities, and particularly a city like New York? Toni?
I hope so. You know, I am a little nervous, though. You know, the fact that, as you pointed out in that article and as news reports discussed after the Republican National Convention, I don't think there was one reference to cities. But quite frankly, we haven't been talking about cities in Washington under a Democratic president. And to Bruce's point a little bit, that's suggesting that there's a movement towards regionalism and mega regions as more of the focus and away from cities. And I think also, even given that we've got an African American president, it's still difficult to talk about cities. And the way in which it's coded to also be about race and poverty, two words we don't talk about every day. So it seems to be really challenged, a challenging time for Washington to talk about cities, even in the context of looking at fiscal responsibility and fiscal and government spending reductions. But I hope that there is a time, and just looking at the way that I'm working in cities, in a city like Detroit, for example, I'm hopeful that in a next term or the next 4 years, whoever is there, infrastructure gets back on the table, because I think that perhaps that is an opportunity to focus resources in a city and regional context around important infrastructure investments that still need to be made in our cities. We had stimulus several years ago, which was investment in 19th and 20th century infrastructure. And I think if we really want to get serious about cities and regions and infrastructure, I hope that we have an opportunity to move towards 21st century infrastructure that's looking at more innovative ways of using landscape for water remediation, waste, for example, and energy. So I've heard a little bit of that talk recently, and I hope that some things are set in motion, because I think those have great impacts on cities.
Even there, I think it's interesting when when the shorthand for infrastructure is roads and bridges, right? And so even to have a conversation about 21st century infrastructure is difficult in soundbite terms, because what people understand that produces jobs is roads and bridges. That's what they know. Getting people to focus on what they don't know or they're not as familiar with, I think is certainly challenging from a communication standpoint, doesn't read well in the media, but I think that's a challenge if we're to move forward. Do you want to jump in?
No, I would really echo both what Toni and Harry said. I think that, the problem is that, notwithstanding the fact that we do have a more urban president now, at the end of the day, to be a pro-city president, you really have to have really lived and experienced what it's like to live in cities, so that you understand the fabric of what makes a city great and what specific challenges are faced by cities. And part of the problem is that cities are very different, and so we talk about sort of a Detroit or an older city where they still do have a sort of a stigma around city equals poverty, poor people, African Americans, Hispanics, and those are not traditionally very historically powerful constituencies in our country. And yet if you look at cities like Phoenix or other cities which have a very different demographic and a very different set of challenges given the nature of their planning issues, they're not a monolithic asset class, right? They're very different depending on where you are. And so I think that also presents challenges for having a really smart federal urban policy, because cities are very different. And so I think the challenge is to have a commitment to cities and then figure out how you translate that into flexible policy and financing streams that allow cities to address the conditions on the ground that they see. But it's not one size does not fit all, because cities are really different.
On the other hand, it is interesting to recognize that we are at this moment in time where clearly the market is moving back to the center. I mean, there's a demand for that, and cities like Phoenix are particularly challenged, again, to re-knit a fabric, to increase density, to increase sustainability, at a moment when sort of all the infrastructure there enables something else to happen, right? Just the opposite to happen. So really trying to rethink how Phoenix looks more like New York is the challenge. Now, it won't ever be New York. It won't ever look like this. But I do think that effort we were talking earlier about Salt Lake City, and the desire there to make their central city more vibrant is really important to a lot of places around the country, and surprising places that not too many years ago I thought would never get there. So that's quite interesting. Harry, I want to ask you, if you could take the next president by the arm and say, okay, You've got to get this right if you want to enable the innovation and productivity that cities naturally create for this country. What would they be?
So first, for probably this president, we need to make sure that that this fiscal cliff is taken care of in the right way. If rescission happens and these big budget cuts go into effect, it's going to have really bad consequences for cities across the country. Cities are still kind of at the very end of their cuts to services, and if those cuts at the federal level go through, they're going to trickle down to cities that are just now kind of strengthening, at least their fiscal situations. I think what needs to really happen is a continuation or maybe a validation of the kind of urban initiatives that President Obama started at the beginning of his term that were most obvious during the kind of go-go days of the White House urban affairs that ended up fading away, and who knows what it does now. So I think there needs to be a conscious effort to, again, say we support these sustainability initiatives, we support the partnerships between HUD and the Department of Transportation. If that happens, there's a chance that we can kind of build on the good things that have already happened during the Obama administration. But if again we start from scratch and we don't have those same conversations, we're going to have a problem.
Yeah. Alicia, I know you've argued that we've got to get a lot more than policy right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in my view, what you have now is a long history of a hodgepodge. I'll wear my banker hat, right? I'm the banker on the panel now. I think what you have is a long history of a hodgepodge of programs that have been adopted over many multiple administrations with multiple different constituencies, all of whom do not in any practical way add up to coherent urban fiscal policy. And so you'll have the new markets program, you'll have housing policy, you'll now have some interesting things going on at the Department of Transportation or at EPA or any of these things. But what you really need to do is sort of step back and think about cities themselves as an asset class, as a community that you are trying to finance and understand what the issues are and the particular, again, idiosyncrasies of any particular city. You're not going to be building 32-story mixed-use towers in downtown Phoenix, most likely. Land use is not the issue there. But you need to sort of step back and say, we are spending billions of dollars, either in direct appropriation or in tax expenditure, to encourage and incentivize a variety of different outcomes. They are not coordinated, they are not connected. And you could actually step back and look at all of those dollars, and then, God forbid, we actually take some dollars out of the mortgage interest tax deduction and reallocate that towards a coherent urban housing policy. And again, you're not talking about raising taxes, you're talking about reallocating existing dollars so that you could let cities take a pool of money and a flexible set of incentives and really create the kind of cities and mixed-use environments and mixed-income environments which are absolutely necessary for us to maintain our economic sort of position in the world globally, and that's really the bigger issue. So the feds are out there with like 18 different vertical streams of funding, and you need a much more horizontal approach. We have the money, we have the tools, but we need to figure out how to knit them together and then design a bureaucracy that functions to downstream financing.
Toni, I'm sure you had experience in Detroit with the regional approaches that this administration has taken, which I think it was an inch toward what you're calling for, I think. It was the inch forward to saying, can we make these policies more coherent, more feasible? Of course, on the other hand, sort of everything underneath it was still chugging along in a very siloed way. What was your experience with those policies?
Well, it's part that and it's part what Harry said. There was this really, robust, steaming engines out the gate, 4 years ago, and looking at real locally oriented urban initiatives, sustainable communities, When the automobile industry was still, at the bottom rung, there was an initiative around the auto-oriented communities, of which Detroit was in, and there were a number of really significant and actually some of the more meaningful meetings and work sessions actually that I've had in Washington that brought all of these different agencies together to look at the condition. The challenge we have now is now that the automobile industries are recovering, the headlines are saying Detroit is back. Well, Detroit, the city, is not back, and Detroit, the city, has for a very long time not been about just the automobile industry. So we have these coded words again, where you think things are better. The foot is off the brake of the pedal of these initiatives. It's same thing, the analogous thing is Manhattan is New York City. Well, if you look outside of Manhattan, the rest of the boroughs, we still have some challenges in our communities. So, a bigger, loftier idea, for me would be how we can get Washington to come back together and imagine that there were an agency that was the aspects of HUD, aspects of transportation, aspects of commerce, aspects of transportation. What we need is an agency that is looking at access to opportunity. If we grow our economy and the people in it within these cities, then things will happen. Then cities and mayors will have the ability to use this more flattened sort of toolkit of resources to start to put things in place. So I would love at a much higher level, in order to get what we were just talking about to happen on the ground, that there is a moment in time where we can really rethink the bureaucracy there that will then enable cities to have more leeway on the ground to work. And these things are so interconnected, these siloed departments now sometimes are not really helping us. Sustainable communities got a little close at that. If we can get back to some things like that, I think that would be great. And then the other thing I would take the leader by the arm and do is empower the Conference of Mayors. I'd meet with them and empower them to come up with an urban agenda. See what that happens when you think about the mayors as the bottom-up grassroots sort of revolution that's putting an agenda on the table around what we need to make our cities better. And use that as the kitchen cabinet of looking at urban reform at the level on the ground, which includes cities and regions, not because so many of our cities are really working in that larger context. But get those voices and those actors and those implementers actively engaged in helping to inform the policy directly. So those would be a couple things I would like to see.
Toni, you have been right at the center, I think, of one of the toughest and in some ways most imaginative comeback strategies, particularly as it relates to use of land. And I think a lot of people perceive it, although I know you would argue with me here, but they perceive it as the city abandoning land that it previously serviced to try to become more dense, try to become more efficient and productive. Can you talk about the political aspects of trying to get something like that done locally? Because it's one thing to talk about federal policy, but it's also a question of, okay, so what are we willing to do? What can we do locally?
Sure. Carol's talking about the work that I've been doing in Detroit for the last 3 years, which is the challenge of obviously a city in the last decade that's lost 25% of its population, and as a result of that continues to increase its portfolio of vacant and abandoned properties. It has over 150,000 vacant parcels that in total probably equal the size of the island of Manhattan. And 3 years ago, there was great fear as we were introducing this term shrinking city, in the American media. Folks there on the ground started to recoil and be very fearful that this was, urban renewal redux times 3. That this was about annexation, the suburbs taking over the city literally, and folks being forced out, and their services being shut off. And so this was a great concern. And it was a concern because there were real serious conversations around the city's ability with so much of a reduction of revenue stream, but still having to care for the same physical size of a city, how it was going to fashion and be able to service that landscape with so little resources. And in many places, 20 some odd square miles, there wasn't the same utilization of those services. There weren't same number of businesses and people living there. So there's been really tough conversations around what does it mean to redo a vision for a city, create new land use opportunities, and then recalibrate the way that services are delivered in a more equitable way. Now, the things that have happened between 3 years ago and now is that the city is near bankrupt, and just like New York did in the 70s, has been really close to these conversations around receivership and control boards and emergency managers, which it currently is in a consent agreement now. So the state is now more hands-on in controlling the fiscal decisions of the city. So that we got to that and beyond the sort of political wrangling of it, because there was a fiscal reality of a bankruptcy, just literally no money. So that has kind of set a table of people's willingness to accept the hard code reality. And it's interesting because the conversations with residents and other stakeholders in the city is much more understanding of this is no longer sustainable. I can't afford it, my household can't afford it because my water bill keeps going up. And quite frankly, it's not fair for me to pay this rate of water bill for an area that doesn't need the same capacity. So the city is now talking about, and we're actually aligning this with how we think different parts of the city can be more dense, and accepting that there are parts of the city that will no longer return to a traditional landscape of residential units. So we're changing those land uses to other things, either public purpose or actually potentially areas of new job creation where that service capacity will be quite different. So under duress, if you will, the city has just had to accept that reality. Residents and folks on the ground have had to accept that reality, and it's actually very good. I mean, it came about in a very challenging way, but I think we're going to be laying out some really interesting ideas for cities that are suffering from these same conditions on how you actually right-size land use decisions and performance of your city through city systems and infrastructure.
I want to ask you about, each of you, about the reverse of policy, and let me start with you, Alicia. Are there policies, or which policies, are those that prevent cities from achieving their potential? In other words, if you could get rid of policies, what would they be? I mean, you mentioned the mortgage deduction and reframing that. We think you should run for office now.
I'll probably get 2 votes.
Yeah, exactly. So are there policies you'd just like to get rid of because you think they hold cities back?
Well, I mean, again, I think that, let's take the residential sector in general. I think that the fact that people still view it very much as the residential sector from a policy and or financing perspective is actually in and of itself part of the problem. Because you have to recast what it is in terms of the built environment and what you're trying to achieve. So instead of thinking about it as residential policy, and then you have various residential programs, and how do you finance this building, and this heavy overemphasis still on supporting home ownership versus rental, and rental, of course, being the primary housing stock for cities, particularly older cities, where a lot of young people, and you have a very different demographic, and you have new immigration, and really renting being the gateway to cities. So I think that the problem is, by, again, narrowly casting what the policy is, we have to have a housing policy as opposed to, we have to have a policy that is thinking holistically about what cities and sub-cities within cities need, and allowing mayors to make those priority choices about saying what we really need is housing for teachers and cops, and they are also going to need a supermarket. And so therefore, we don't need to go to do 18 different transactions in order to finance the supermarket and the workforce housing, because the programs right now only really allow you to do low-income housing, and if you're lucky, fight tooth and nail to get somebody to do a supermarket 10 blocks away. Right. So I think that it's already the problem by calling it a housing policy, right? It needs to be an urban policy that allows mayors and stakeholders on the ground to say, this is our place. What does this place need? And then we're going to adapt the tools that we have. Look, at the federal government is using tons of balance sheet to support all of these sectors. But you could get much better efficiencies and much better outcomes on the ground if you would say the policy is addressing urban needs, and then we're going to allow you to use the HUD 223D4 program to actually underwrite the income from a supermarket. You don't have to go to the Commerce Department. You don't have to do a new markets deal. That's a political decision that the federal government can make to allow those decisions to be made locally and still use the same dollars. This is not about increasing the federal budget or tax expenditure. I think that's really the key to this.
It's very interesting calling for urban policy. I have a Google alert on urban policies. You may too. No, but you never see, it is very rare to see a domestic article pop up under urban policy. It's all international, almost never US, so it's very interesting. We only have about 2.5 minutes left, so I want to get Toni and Harry in on this question as well.
So I second everything you said. I mean, obviously, mortgage interest deduction would be a great thing just to get rid of. But the other thing is kind of a...
You don't even have to get rid of it. You just have to lower it a little bit and reallocate the money to
there's a third
workforce
vote.
housing.
Third vote. You just got the third vote.
But a transition needs to be made. The story of urban policy, whether it's been explicit or not, for the last 30 years has been one where the federal government gives money to states and states give money to cities. So keeping the same amount of revenue going towards cities, but going to states, but redirecting it directly to cities, I think would be a change that would have great benefits in urban areas. If you didn't have funds going for transportation to State's Department of Transportation, who have suburban and rural constituencies to worry about, you'd see a better focus on transportation in urban areas. So that just kind of switch to thinking about direct funding for cities would be important.
Great. Toni?
It takes 10 months to demo one house in Detroit because of that problem. Yeah. Because of the way with which the dollars flow from the state to a state agency, to a city agency, to a contractor. I mean, oh my God. 10 months to demolish one house with federal funding. So this is not a policy question, but the mechanics of how we use and access these resources is part of the challenge, which is why the idea of not thinking about, HUD, housing, 72-point font, urban development, 6-point font, that we need some much more integrated sets of tools by which cities and regions can address the geographic kinds of problems that they have in a more holistic way, which would then kind of cut through the sort of mechanics of having to go through this maze of
waste,
trickle downs and time that we just waste. Yeah. And 4 years goes really fast, and when you overlay that cycle of decision making, it's very hard to be impactful in a visible way in cities. So I think we really do have to move to an approach that is really trying to break down the silos of some of these departments, continuing to build on the innovative thinking that led to sustainable communities to try to get to some more holistic packages of approaches that cities can use.
Great. Help me thank our panel. All right.